So let's talk a little bit about the new album, Ecstatic Science. I'm talking with cellist Gabriel Cabezas and violinist Rob Moose. You guys have a really interesting ensemble and interesting, great, fun music to listen to on this disc. A lot to talk about. But the first thing I want to ask you about is the group of instruments here. You have a flute, a trumpet, a cello, a clarinet, a viola, and a violin. It's kind of an interesting combination. How did it come about that you ended up with that formulation?
Yeah, absolutely. When we were first discussing starting a group like this, our main objective was to accompany bands and songwriters in performances of theirs. So we tried to come up with an instrumentation that would pair well with an existing kind of rock band setup. So having some strings, some woodwinds, and brass would sort of add a nice, diverse orchestral color to a performing situation without overlapping with things that would already be there in the band. But really, we chose the instrumentation based on the individual people that we hoped to be in the group. My friend CJ and I, with whom I kind of started the group, we were just discussing like who would be into this kind of thing, and we started to get a list of names together, and the instrumentation kind of coalesced around that.
Yeah. Tell us where the name comes from. yMusic, because it's just a letter Y.
Yes. We chose the name because most of the members of the group were born around the same time at the early stages of Generation Y, which is now more commonly, referred to as millennials. But we sort of felt like the being born at that time and kind of going to school and coming out of school and starting our professional careers, we were sort of like the first generation to have the internet and some of those kind of, access to different types of music and stuff that just became so much more easy in that generation, informed our sensibilities and aesthetic. So we wanted to kind of name ourselves after that coincidence.
Let's talk about some of the composers on the recording. It's called Ecstatic Science, and the title track is by Missy Mazzolli. Can you tell us a little bit about that particular piece?
Yeah, Missy's piece is really interesting. First of all, we love it and her, but also we loved the title. We loved that it sort of evoked a sense of something that was mechanical, but also just really joyful, and that was something that we thought really encapsulated both her piece and the collection of pieces as a whole. Missy's piece, I find it to be really interesting how she varies texture, and she goes often to these sort of slidey textures in the strings that sort of evoke different synthesizers and things like that. And there's a lot that reminds me of different synth lines that I think is really compelling.
One thing that I notice on this particular CD is that all the composers tend to approach your instrumentation or your group a little bit differently. They focus on something different with each of their pieces. Was that a conscious thing that you were striving for when you went to these composers, or did it just turn out that way?
I think it was a pretty natural result, I guess, of everybody's individual processes, but it's something that we've always enjoyed about being a group with a unique instrumentation and depending on commissions to have material. I feel like each time we get a new piece, there's the potential to expand even our own concept of what the group can sound like very significantly. And if say there have been, 40 pieces or something written for the group, it's like each composer kind of has a big stake in what the overall sound is. So that's the most exciting thing for us about getting new music, is like, what will we learn about ourselves this time?
Tell us a little bit about the Caroline Shaw piece on here. Caroline Shaw, Pulitzer winner, and now she has a piece for you called Draft of a High Rise, which is an evocative title. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, she was co-commissioned by Carnegie Hall to write that piece for our recital there as part of their 125th anniversary. And she wrote a 3-movement work. Each of the movements are around 4 minutes long. And she initially had this whole plan to include having us singing in the piece. And it was interesting for us to see how that material shifted. Like, we can tell exactly where it was going to be, and it ended up becoming instrumentally rendered instead. But she was inspired by the idea of different stages of architectural sketches and drawings, and the movement names are titled accordingly. And I think she also, in the process of writing it, was impacted by the last presidential election. So I guess her piece is kind of a response to those two different elements. And we really love playing it. Particularly the third movement is such an interesting. The way it's constructed is really interesting. It kind of starts with this like chanty sort of loop of material amongst 4 different instruments that are introduced individually, and we're able to kind of control the rate at which we're playing our material, and it creates this just gorgeous like spinning sonic structure. And then Gabe and our trumpet player CJ play these, I think, 4 phrases of this beautiful melody that feel like they're coming from a film score all of a sudden over top of this texture. And I always love being in that musical place before it kind of breaks apart and heads to a more frenetic conclusion.
How does that process work for you? I mean, do you go to a composer and say, we're interested in commissioning a work, then you let them come up with the idea, or do you work it out together, or how does it happen?
Every situation's a little different, but one of the things that is not necessarily unique about this group, but something that is really important to our process is that we tend to work with people that we have personal relationships with, our friends and our colleagues. And so a commissioning process isn't necessarily a formal email with terms and whatever. It could be, we've been really needing a piece that's like this long. Do you have any time in your schedule to sort of work on that for us? And how can we make that happen? Is there a grant we can apply for? Do you have something coming up, a performance opportunity? There are just so many ways to go about it that I think it feels informal to a lot of people what we do, but we've loved working with our friends that way.
You've got a couple of works here. They're kind of like the bookends of your album by Gabriella Smith, and that's a composer that I know that you guys are interested in and supportive of. Can you talk a little bit about her and the 2 pieces that are on this album?
Sure. Gabriella is a composer that I was really happy to bring to the group. We became friends in college, and I've always really loved her music. I find her to be a really singular voice and someone who's really willing to use instruments in unusual ways to achieve things that feel inevitable and, again, joyful and just really, really compelling music. Her works, if we're talking more about science and things like that, Gabriella is always enamored of science, and particularly of natural science. And she's always inspired by just nature in general. And the last piece on the program on the album, I should say, is called Maré. She wrote while she was at an artist colony in Brazil, off the coast of, I think in Bahia somewhere. And she would be able to see the tides roll in from her sort of writing desk. And she became really inspired by that motion and this general transformation. And the opening piece, Desolations, also has sort of these mini transformations over time, and that's something that she's inspired by. And she uses all of our instruments in different ways to achieve these effects. She uses a lot of extended techniques. She often uses string instruments percussively, and also there are some really interesting wind textures in both of these pieces, growls and whispers and different things that I look over at the wind half of the group when we play this music, and I don't really know how they're making those sounds, but it's definitely a wild ride.
talk about these composers as people that are in your personal orbit. Do you work with them then in the studio or in the practice hall when you're bringing these pieces together?
Not as much as you might expect. I'm trying to think. I suppose in some cases we get to have more and more interaction with them, but in a weird way, because we at least when we formed, we're the only group with this instrumentation. We have like I'm trying to find the right word. We've just spent the most time with this combination of instruments, and so of course we're like really open to what the composer has written and any other input they want to give us. But I think a large part of our process is kind of trying to find like a level of naturalness with this new material that came from the outside, and really like internalizing it and making it feel like it's our own music. So I feel like there's a point for us where we're like, yeah, let's workshop it. Let's have you hear it. Let's go back and forth. And then there's the point where we sort of decide like, okay, we've got it now. We need to make this into our thing. So it's not exclusionary. It just sort of evolves in that way. And usually when we're making an album, it's not like we have each of the different composers coming and helping us choose takes or things like that. We definitely get their input on mixes and stuff like that. But we become at a certain point kind of independent with the music.
I want to thank you both for talking about this album. Can't wait to share it with our listeners. Cellist Gabriel Cabezas and violinist Rob Moose, two members of the ensemble yMusic. The latest album is called Ecstatic Science. Thanks so much for joining us here on FM 91.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Our pleasure.